So, here we have the violin score for Eine kleine Nachtmusik. To show this, we are using the Cine Samples Light library, and I'll simply play the melody with a legato sound. And although it sounds pleasant enough, it doesn't have the right feel yet. But what is interesting about this score is that the bass clef is not showing the musical notes, but the notes we need to play to control the key switches in order to achieve the correct articulations for this piece. So we need to remember to play the key switches fractionally in advance of the melody, and in doing so, we will have the correct articulation for our melody line. So I'll play it now slowly. And we can hear that it sounds much livelier and lighter. On the bass clef, when I play an A, I get the legato string sound, and when I play the B, I get staccato. These two articulation options, that of staccato and legato, will in reality allow you to input the large majority of orchestral music into your DAW, and is certainly a good place to start without getting too deep. So, these are the basic fundamentals of recording your key switches. But we do have other articulation options, obviously. To look at this, we will open our Cine Symphony library by going back into Cubase. As we mentioned previously, this is an excellent library even in the light version with which to work. It sounds excellent and has enough features to achieve excellent results. What is important in this example is that we have a multi-patch. This means that the entire keyboard ranges from violin to the viola, onto the cello, and right down to the contrabass. The VSL library has more features, but this package is simpler and still sounds excellent, and allows us to get results very quickly. So we certainly recommend Cine Symphony Lite as an option. It also offers the user all the instruments from an orchestra, such as brass, woodwind and percussion, at an affordable price. As we are discussing articulations in this section, by clicking here on the mapping button, we can see the options available to us here. In the center, we have the key switch map option. And on the right now, we can see those options. We can see here that we have the articulation for the long samples, or the legato or sustained samples, assigned to the A1 key. And under the B1 key, we have the short or staccato samples. These are the options available to us now. But for what we are trying to achieve here, that is all we need. At the top here, we have the dynamics section. And with this, we have velocity assigned to the short or staccato samples. What this means is that by playing dynamically, I can adjust the volume and the expression of the staccato samples. In our example, and in general, this is a very good thing, as playing staccato strings with dynamics allow us to play our music into the DAW with a lot of expression. If we play something in without any dynamics and try to adjust them later, or assign the key switches after the matter, we may make life harder later on. And we don't get to input any feel into our performance. So having a variety of expression possibilities when playing the music in is certainly a better way of working in our opinion. If we listen a little bit, we can hear that we go from piano, or a very light touch, all the way up to forte, even in small musical passages. So trying to input these articulations afterwards would be somewhat more complicated. With the legato samples or sustained samples, velocity is switched off, however. The expression controller for our sustained samples is CC1, or the modulation wheel. As we have shown in previous sections, the expression control on legato samples allows you to adjust the volume and expression of the sample while it is being played, and not just in the attack phase. The downside here is that if I am playing my melody in and controlling the key switches, I would need a third hand to control the modulation wheel. One way of helping here is to record the modulation wheel in its upmost position in order to have the full expression setting available whenever playing the sustained samples. If the wheel was down, then we would not hear the sustained samples. This allows me to play the music in using the key switches, and then later on, I will have to write the modulation wheel settings into my DAW in order to control CC1 throughout the piece. You could consider other options for inputting the expression data in real time, such as an expression pedal or a breath controller. Having said this, using a breath controller brings its own issues, such as the problem of breathing. It is an excellent option for inputting brass and woodwind, as it forces you to breathe much like a brass or woodwind player would have to. But when inputting string instruments, we would recommend using either the modulation wheel or potentially an expression pedal, as playing the melody with your right hand, controlling the key switches with your left hand, especially as you have to play them slightly in advance of the melody line, and simultaneously blowing into the breath controller to control dynamics, is quite a feat. But like most skills, these could certainly be learnt. The question is, however, do they help you input the music in an efficient and musical way? So now, if we look at the keyboard while the music is being played, then we can see that I play the keys slightly in advance of the musical notes. And with the staccato instrument, I have control over the dynamics, which we can hear especially here in the section where we remain on the staccato sample for quite a while. And if I wish to add dynamics to the legato instrument, I simply play the modulation wheel later. Another option available to us here in the mapping section is the velocity map. What this section allows us to do is to change key switches with velocity. If I play softly, then the staccato sample is played. If, however, I exceed the threshold that we can specify here, the software switches over to the legato samples. One advantage of this is obviously that I don't need to use my left hand to specify the key switches. And a disadvantage could be that I don't have complete control over the dynamics in theory of, for example, the staccato samples, because the moment I exceed the threshold specified, the legato samples play. In reality, though, this problem is solved by none of the samples having velocity control of their level. But as we can see at the top, the dynamics are being controlled by CC1 for both sets of samples. And we can hear this when I play. Now, obviously, which method you choose to use depends on your personal preferences. In our case, the key switch is the preferred option. But being able to input the dynamics from the modulation wheel for both sets of samples could clearly be an advantage for someone else. Using the key velocity to switch samples is certainly okay when dealing with two instruments. But if we had, for example, 4 instruments, then switching between them with velocity would be much more demanding, if not impossible. If we look at our score once more, we can see that above certain notes there is a symbol which signifies that we should play these notes with a higher velocity. This allows us to switch between the samples using velocity and following the score. So when a note has the symbol above it, I strike the key harder to switch to the legato samples. A problem occurs when I get to the section later on, which is simply staccato samples. And that problem is that I cannot control dynamics from the keyboard. I have to control them from the modulation wheel. And in my opinion, this becomes somewhat challenging. So in effect, using this option means I simply focus with the right hand on choosing the correct sample with the dynamics and playing the melody. And whilst I have the option of controlling the dynamics with the modulation wheel. Almost all libraries will have these options available to you. So whichever library you choose, you should be able to choose whether velocity switches the samples or whether key switch chooses them. And here, for example, we also have the option to specify a custom setup. For now, we are going to leave the key switch map active. Of course, not every excellent musician, be it a guitarist or a violinist, etc., has the necessary dexterity to use the key switches and play the music in, as well as a trained pianist or someone who has extensive experience of playing classical music into a computer could. So what do these people do? Well, we have the possibility, as we mentioned earlier, to play the individual elements in separately, for example, playing the melody or even putting it in step time or via the mouse, and then adding the key switches later, and then adding the expression control as data. But as we are dealing with MIDI data, we also have the option to slow the sequence down and play the music in more slowly. This, in our opinion, is an excellent option for those without the skills required to select key switches fractionally before playing the melody in with the right hand. So to show this, we will slow our sequence down from 115 BPM to about 60 BPM and play the music in at this slower tempo. Now, having played it in, we can simply set the tempo to our desired tempo and listen back to our performance at the correct speed. If we now go in and look at our MIDI data, we can see the notes, and even though I didn't have to, I have retained the length of the notes in my playing. With legato, it would be important to play the correct length. But with staccato, I could have held the keys much longer, and the sound would still have been staccato. In effect, what I want to achieve is as much of my own performance as possible, and this is shown here. If we look lower down in our editor, we can see the key switches. And if we look closely, we can see that they come slightly in advance of the MIDI notes. Obviously, one thing we must not do is quantize the key switch MIDI data. If you wish to, in theory, you could quantize the MIDI note data. But if you quantize the key switch data, then the danger is that the key switch will occur after the note has been played, and therefore will not work. Now, if you were a terrible player and made many errors, you do have the option, obviously, to go in and edit the MIDI data directly. So if I had made many mistakes, I could choose to simply correct them later. Another option would be to play the key switches in later, if there were errors in that section, or if I had simply played the melody in using the legato instrument. Also, you don't have to worry about velocity when playing the key switches in. They are simply switches, so as long as the MIDI note appears, the key switch will function. There are libraries that offer automated key switching by analyzing how you play. So, for example, if you play short notes, it will assume that you want staccato articulation. And if you play long notes that overlap, it will assume that you want legato articulation. And this can be useful, but once again, in reality, you will probably have to go in and edit some of this for it to be perfect. So for us, we feel that the key switch option that we have shown is an excellent choice for most users. And in the next chapter, we will show some practical examples of this.